I think it's okay. Great. So let's start. So this is the third segment of my coverage of classical robotics, and this is the problem of motion planning. And this is again a problem which was like the burning topic of the 1980s and 90s, but my belief is essentially by the 90s it was solved. Okay. And so what's the problem? The problem is we have a robot in some start configuration, and we want it to go to some goal configuration while avoiding obstacles. So there are many settings of this problem depending on the robot and what space and what obstacles and so on. So there's obviously a simple-minded version, which is you have a mobile robot roaming around on this floor and it doesn't collide with chairs and tables and so on. Or you can talk about this for your Franca arm, and it has to move and get to a desired configuration. In that case, it's going to be in some 6 degrees of freedom space, and it has to avoid colliding with obstacles. And not only should the hand of the robot not collide, but while it's moving, the elbow shouldn't bang and destroy a precious Ming vase. Okay. So how do we do this? So I can start with this baby example. So this baby example is about a 2-link robot. So it's on the left. So you have theta 1 and theta 2. So those are the 2 degrees of freedom. And then we have our robot arm, which is kind of here, right? This is the base of the robot arm. It has to go from here to there. So there's the start configuration. So what you need to do is, and these are obstacles. So this A and B and C are obstacles. So what this arm needs to do is to kind of retract and then move and then end up in that configuration, right? So so this is the problem. So basically, you have to avoid not just collision of the end effector, but also with any part of the robot. No part of the robot should collide with an obstacle. So how do we do this? Okay. And as I said, this was all worked out in the 1980s and 90s. And so one concept which is important is the concept of configuration space. Or here it's abbreviated as C space, configuration. I mean, this term comes from physics. Configuration is whatever. Suppose you have a system of particles in a box. Then how do you describe the configuration? It's really like the position of every particle and its momentum, something like that. Sometimes we use the term state space for a similar concept. So the configuration space for the robot is in the joint angle space, so theta 1, theta 2. So that's what you see on the right. So this diagram is theta 1, theta 2. Okay, now, but you have these obstacles, A, B, C. So these obstacles are some areas in R2 that we do not want to go to. So what you can do is you can translate them, because you know the kinematics of the robot. You can translate them into where they would be in configuration space. So that is shown here by this. A is the conversion from sort of Euclidean space to joint angle space of this obstacle A. You have B, which is the conversion of obstacle B into configuration space. Similarly for this. And why these look funny is because with this joint angles, the relationship between that and R2 involves all these trigonometric functions of sines and cosines and so on. So that's why the shapes are going to look funny. So is this clear? Configuration space, which is sometimes abbreviated as C space. In C space, which is like this joint angle space, we can take all the obstacles and put them there. So far, so good. So this was worked out by Lozano Perez. Okay, but now this is correct if the robot is a point robot. But the robot is not a point robot. The robot may have some like a mobile robot moving around in space might have a diameter of half a meter or something. And then your KUKA arm or Frank arm also has some finite thickness. So how do we deal with that? So here is a one way of solving this problem. So what you have here is there is this XY space, and then there is this obstacle shown by this triangle, which is shaded in gray. And my robot is a disk, right? So this is my robot disk. So what do I do with my robot disk? Either I have to do some complicated stuff with my robot disk, or what I do is I just grow all the obstacles, right? So I grow the obstacle by corresponding to the radius of this mobile robot. Okay, so that is what is shown here. Okay, so you take the real obstacles, you grow them appropriate to the size of the robot. And then when we solve the path planning problem for avoiding obstacles, we just deal with a point. So a point has to move in space. We don't have to consider the fact that the robot has some diameter. So you've just modified the C space. So we did two conversions. So the first conversion is going from Euclidean space to configuration space with joint angles. The second was that you grow the obstacles by an amount corresponding to the physical dimensions of the robot, like its width and so on. So far, so good? Okay, and now you suddenly can get into problems which, correct, the problems are real, not fake. So suppose you had these two obstacles, right? So it looks like, oh, there's a path between them. But if your robot is a fat robot, it has a certain radius. And with that radius robot, it cannot go through that gap. And that is revealed by the fact that once you have expanded all the obstacles, you have grown the obstacles corresponding to the sizes of the robot, then these obstacles actually intersect. That means that there's no gap there. So what we do is we do this kind of transformation in the beginning, and then we have a setting of the problem where there is some space, and then there are all these obstacles. Okay, does that make sense? Now, note that here my background as a computer vision person has to come in. So this is the standard framing of the problem in robotics, and I can assure you, if you read the literature from the 1980s and 90s, this is just carried through with nary a doubt. But as a computer vision person, the first thing I will have to say is, how do you know where the obstacles are? There's a perception system which has to reveal where they are, and the perception system is always going to be incomplete and error prone, right? So therefore, assuming that all the obstacles are known completely and exactly, this is a simplifying modeling assumption, but it leaves a lot to be desired. And I think you should also note that, do we really need to know all the obstacles? There might be, ultimately you're going to do a task, like your robot has to go and pick up the coffee mug. And it may not need to know all the configuration space obstacles everywhere on this floor. It just needs to not hit anything while getting to that mug. So we need to take this into account, and the solutions we have today will try to take this into account. So when we unpack the box of learning, of perception, which was not common in the 80s and 90s, there was this abstraction of perfect perception, and then you solve the robot motion planning problem as essentially a computational geometry problem. And you could solve it very cleanly. But that came at a cost. The cost was that perfection was assumed to be perfect and complete, which is not a justified assumption. And the solutions we'll try to come up with today will have to go beyond those classical solutions. But you can only go beyond the classical solutions after being aware of the classical solutions. So that is why I'm giving this lecture. Okay, so we got this. Okay. And so what is the key finding? So the key finding is that we can take this configuration space and we are really concerned with the free space part. So C free is the free part of configuration space. And this could be in some higher dimensional setting, depending on the dimensionality of your robot and so on. So in this space, it turns out that that you can find a one-dimensional roadmap. Okay, and then the following is true. That so you let's say you find this roadmap R, which is this one-dimensional entity, and now we can solve the problem of going from any start state to any goal state by the following. The start space may not be on this roadmap, which is okay. What you do is from the start state, you get to the roadmap. It's like you want to drive on the highway system, first you get to the highway system. Okay. Then you travel on the roadmap, and then you take an exit and you get to your goal state. Okay. So that's the framing of the problem, and this framing is complete framing in the sense that if there is a solution which exists, it can be found in this way. And the person who worked on this in detail was John Canny, who is one of our colleagues here at Berkeley. So John Canny's PhD thesis was essentially on how to calculate these roadmaps analytically. Okay. And then, so there are these properties here, which is reachability, which is essentially saying intuitively that you can, from free configuration space, from some point in the free part of configuration space, you can get to the roadmap, and then you can exit similarly. And then if the free part of configuration space is connected, then there is one connected component of R. Because if this free space is not connected, then there's nothing you can do. You cannot go from the start state to the goal state if they are in disconnected parts of the space. So that problem cannot be solved. Is that clear? So the idea is that you're projecting down this more complicated problem to the problem of finding this one-dimensional roadmap, and then you solve the problem there. But it turns out to be very hard, because essentially you can see from the nature of these constraints and that you're going to get all this. This is not a linear problem. I mean, you can see it from the pictures. So it involves what is called semi-algebraic sets, and just don't ask me to explain what that stuff is. Okay. And so John Canny's thesis provided a theoretically complete solution, but in practice, this was very hard to implement and carry out because of the fact that essentially it required all these tools of algebraic geometry. And so there was an alternative technology which was developed, starting from work at Stanford, and then I mean, essentially, Kavraki and Latom is one of the key early papers. And in this, what was done was that instead of trying to solve analytically for this roadmap, there was a probabilistic sampling type approach which was done. And I have this figure here which shows what the probabilistic roadmap looks like. Okay, or one of them. I mean, there can be many. So basically, there are some obstacles here, and you still have this one-dimensional structure here. It's a graph, but it's a one-dimensional structure. And it is a set of points in free space connected by edges. And the idea is that two points are connected by an edge if there is an easy way to get from one to the other. For example, by a straight line path. So in fact, one way to think about it is that, like, just think of this as, okay, I'm at station A, and there's the station C, and I can see a direct path from A to C. So I don't need to do any fancy planning. I just go in a straight line, I can get to C. So then I have an edge in the graph connecting A to C. So basically, you have a whole bunch of points, okay? which are sampled in this space, right? And then you have connectivity based on a simple local planner, like, for example, just go in a straight line from A to B. That if that can be done, you're connected by an edge. Now, in this graph, how do we solve the problem? We solve the problem now of just graph traversal, right? So this is your standard computer science problem. You're given a graph. It has some nodes. It has some edges. If you are at some node C and there is some node F, can you find a path between C to F? And in fact, you can, it's a weighted graph, right? So you can have edges which correspond to the length or how much distance you have to travel or how much time you would have to travel. And then what you do is you can add up those costs, and that's the total cost of going from some node A to some node B. Does that make sense? So, it's actually from having to do very complicated algebraic geometry in computer algebra. It was yeah. So this was a transition which occurred essentially from the 80s to the 90s. Okay. So how do we do this? So now this problem, how do we solve this problem? So I've got the algorithm here. Okay, it is super easy. Okay. So first, this is the pseudocode for this PRM. So why PRM? RM is roadmap. So that's John Caney's concept. PRM is probabilistic roadmap. So this is the work from Kavraki and Latombe. And what's the algorithm? This is it. This is all that that I need to explain. So you have a whole bunch of samples, which are like these points in this space. Okay. And now what you do is you try to find, so initially imagine that there are no edges. Okay, in fact, we can build up the algorithm. This is an algorithm you can think up in 5 minutes, right? You just sample some points in the space. So now you have all those little circles.
Yeah, but the key is to have a tight bound. That's the key. You want to do that in lower complexity.
Yeah, and that can be done. So that's proving properties, but the algorithm is easy, right? Proving properties can be hard. Okay, so now what you do is you are at a point, and what you do is you just find the nearest 3 points. I think this is the key. Okay, so I've got like 100 points, right? Sampled randomly. I pick a point, and then I try to find the nearest 3 points in Euclidean distances. That's easy, right? Nearest neighbor algorithm will do that for you. You find the 3 nearest neighbor. Then you ask for each of these 3 nearest neighbors, can I get there in a straight line? That's also straightforward. You draw the line connecting the point A and B and see if that line intersects an obstacle. So that requires a little bit of work, right? But it's just a computation of, does this line intersect an obstacle, which can be done, okay? And now if you can achieve that, then you draw an edge between them. So now of those 3 neighbors, maybe 2 of them you can get to by a straight line path. For the third one, the straight line path gets blocked by some obstacle. So you don't connect an edge there. Repeat. So now for every node, you have a sense of what are nearby points to which you can go by a straight line path without hitting obstacles. And now you've constructed the graph. So now if I have to solve now I do this work in advance. So this is my construction of the PRM. And now suppose I put you somewhere. So if I'm here, what should I do? And I need to go to some point which is over there. What I do is from this point, I need to get on the highway system, right? So you try to find the nearest edges, the nearest nodes, and see if there's a straight line edge to one of them. Okay, that means I can take the freeway from University Avenue exit. Okay. Then similarly on the other side, from my goal node, I again figure out if there is some node to which I can get by a straight line path. So now I've got 2 nodes on this graph. Okay. Basically, this PRM is like your freeway system. You have a way to get to the freeway system and you have a way out of the freeway system. And in between, you solve a graph minimum path problem. Dijkstra, A star. I mean, there's a, this is the stuff we teach the kids, right? Okay. So everybody knows this. Is that, yeah, question? I mean, it's the only thing you can do. So it's always, so it can be done, but it'll be, the complexity will go up. So now there was an industry after this, which is, this is the PRM version, which is what you do where initially, if you have to solve many versions of the problem, you create this PRM once and pay the cost for it. And after that, you can do any query quickly. Now, suppose you have to solve just one version or setting of the problem. Then it seems like too much work, right? So you should do less work. And then there are these algorithms called RRT and RRT star and rapidly exploring something. So again, books have been written on that stuff, but conceptually, what I've told you is all that you know. And now let me again put in the vision person's critique of this whole setup. So what's the vision person's critique of this setup? Okay, first let me get to that final picture. Okay, so the algorithm is, I told you, it is, you can't, it's as simple as this. So what's the vision person's critique of this setup? It builds on what, huh? Yeah, you do not know all the obstacles in advance, right? And this thing will keep changing. And do I really need to know about all the obstacles everywhere on this floor in order to solve this problem? So this is an example of I think now I'm editorializing. I mean, in classical robotics, these are some of the issues which I find unsatisfactory. So one is this sharp distinction between perception and action. So you assume that there exists a perfect perception system which creates this complete map of the world. Okay. And so the map of the obstacles and so on. And you say, okay, you perception system, you guys get to it, you do this job, and I'll talk to you only after that. And then the response of a vision person is, no, I'm not going to do it. Okay. But the robotics people say, I need to write papers. I'm going to assume that this will be delivered to me, and now I will proceed beyond that. So this is a fundamental divide which today's work goes beyond. Okay, and then we get into there's a learning aspect which is separate. So there's a perception aspect and a learning aspect, which in modern robotics, we sort of have to take both of those seriously. But in classical robotics, you sort of bypass that by assuming that perception was perfect. So now it was just a computational geometry problem. It was a beautiful, elegant setting. So in that era, I mean, this was work being done by my colleagues here. I would look at the robotics talks and I would look at the talks in vision, and in vision, nothing worked. And the robotics people in this setting, they could solve everything, right? And so it's interesting that now vision works. Yeah, but so this is okay. So I think this is my summary slide. Usually we assume the geometry is fully known. This is a critique. We can do this. We will reapproach this topic a bit later when we try to solve the problem for navigation. And in navigation, it's turned out that really the problem is not as hard as it seems. And because what you need are very good heuristics when I'm trying to solve the problem of navigating from here to the door, it's actually not a hard problem, and it's mostly a vision problem, because we do not have these very, very complicated spaces. So this is these configuration space algorithms were like were in the setting of classical theoretical computer science, which is that you're dealing with the worst case, right? Whereas we don't have to deal with the worst case. We in fact design an environment such that it's not difficult to navigate. I mean, if you had to solve complicated O of N6 problem, every time you wanted to go from here to the door, you would say this architect was terrible, right? Or this house is very cluttered. We don't live in that kind of world. So from here, it's easy, right? Where is free space? I mean, I just go there and then I go there, and you just can solve the problem locally, and that sometimes doesn't work because you can get into dead ends. So, but if you have some mechanism for backtracking and so forth, you can work this out. And we'll do examples of that when we study navigation. So it doesn't really need to make the assumption that the world is fully known a priori. We can do the perception as we go along. The perception is incomplete, it is noisy, and yet we can plan paths. Okay. So let me do 5 minutes on this this other classical problem, which is going from paths to trajectories. So this is mostly about understanding what the terminology. So what's the difference between a path and a trajectory? Okay, so a path. Okay, I'll do it by writing. Okay, so let me write. Okay, so what is a path? The path is the sequence. I mean, of positions on this curve. Trajectory is the sequence of positions as a function of time. So when we write, right, you can have information which is just the sequence XY pairs on my signature. Or I could have the functions x of t, comma y of t. And obviously the second carries more information because from that you can derive the path. So in fact, way back like 20, 30 years ago, when people were developing signature recognition systems, there were two versions of the problem. So there's the OCR version where you just have the signature as an image and you need to recognize it. Or there is a version where you do it with a stylus on some tablet or something like that, and then you have access to the trajectory information. And no surprise, that version of the problem is easier and for which you have better solutions. So this is it. That's the difference between path and trajectory. So trajectory requires, trajectory is a specification of the configuration as a function of time, right? Easy, state x as a function of time. Path is that you just have this as a function of arc length. And then how do you go between the two? You can define what's called a time scaling. So the time scaling will essentially map from this the notion of time to coordinates on that curve. The standard way to parameterize that curve is what's called arc length. So you measure distance along the curve as you go from one endpoint to the other. And now as you are moving along that curve, you associate also that with a timestamp. And that's called time scaling. So now, let me give a very intuitive example. Suppose I want to reach and pick up an object. So the trajectory is about okay, what's the path? The path is the position in Euclidean space of my hand and arm and so on. The trajectory refers to this as a function of time. And what do you expect the trajectory to have? So initially, I'm at stationary, then I'm going to accelerate. So I'm moving fast, and then I'm going to slow down by the time I actually come to touch the object, right? That's what you expect. Because the end state, you don't, when you are going to pick up a cup, you do not want to destroy the cup by banging at it at some high speed, right? And you're going to start out at rest. So you're going to start at rest, end at rest. So the velocity should be zero at the endpoints. In between, you accelerate, but you don't want to accelerate super fast in some, you want to accelerate in a smooth way. So this game is what's the game about sort of time scaling and so forth. And again, it's a well worked out problem. There's nothing complicated here. A small observation, which is when we say straight line in what space? They could be straight line in joint angle space, or they could be straight line in task space. So task space, sometimes people use the term operational space. This refers to sort of the Euclidean space in which the object actually is. And a straight line in joint angle space may not be a straight line in task space. And okay. And this is like a reasonable thing to do. You start at velocity 0, you accelerate smoothly, you keep moving, and then you slow down. And similar observations have been made by human. So we can monitor human hands as they are reaching to pick up an object, and you can see this behavior. And kids, when they start, they are not so smooth, but as kids develop with practice picking up objects, they develop these smooth trajectories. Any questions on this? Okay. So far, so good. So I think trajectory is, you know the distinction between a path and a trajectory. So the earlier segment of the lecture, when I was talking about robot path planning, I was just talking about the path. And then you would convert the path into a trajectory, and then you can implement a robot. Though, of course, I have to recall that we are doing it the wrong way because we are assuming that we have this complete knowledge of the environment, which is not quite the right thing to do. Okay, and now I have 15 minutes to do what was originally meant to be a 1-hour lecture. And it's fine. I think I need to just, so I'm going to do short shrift to neuroscience and just convey a few ideas. And because we have learned so much about the basic vocabulary of dynamics and robotics, I think, do it more compactly. So I'm going to talk about, I think, like 2 or 3 things. But I do want you to read the paper. There are 2 very good papers that we'll put on the reading list. So the first is that every field is defined by its heroes. So the hero for biological motor control is this Soviet scientist called Nikolai Bernstein. This guy was amazing. He's like the deepest thinker in this field in the last century. Okay, so he and he was, because he was Russian, he published in Russian. In the West, people did not know a lot about his work. Then there was a time where he fell into trouble with the Russian government, so he was not even known inside Russia. He barely escaped getting sent off to a gulag. But he was doing experiments in the 1930s and 40s, which people in the West did like 20 years later. Okay, but okay, so this is first just praise of Nikolai Bernstein, and you should read him. But he was he appreciated the difficulties and complexities of robotics, or essentially the human version of the problem, which is biological motor control, because he was dealing with, at that time, there were very simple-minded theories. So, for example, there was Pavlov, who was a prominent scientist in the Soviet Union. And Pavlov believed in reflexes, which there is a simple-minded version of reinforcement learning. And the idea was and a simple way of thinking about it would be like a simple feedback control with just the P term or something like that. And again, I'm grossly simplifying, but Bernstein talked about the complexities of the problem, the fact that there would be variability because when the arm is moving, it's never the same condition because you are carrying different loads and so on and so forth. So again, I'm not going to go into a lecture on Bernstein, but I want to give you one tidbit from Bernstein, which I liked a lot, which is the so-called degrees of freedom problem. So the degrees of freedom problem is this, which is that when we have a multi-jointed system, right? Humans, he's talking about humans. We have many joints, and these many joints have to be controlled. And so therefore, there are many degrees of freedom. So if you want to put it in our jargon of robotics and reinforcement learning, it's the challenge of having lots of degrees of freedom when you're trying to do reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is challenging because of the fact that when you have many degrees of freedom. When you have few degrees of freedom, it's not so bad. It's because you're going to go exponential in the number of degrees of freedom, and that's what is problematic. So he had realized this and noticed this. And this is way before any reinforcement learning or anything like that. The other observation was that we have in us the ability to execute certain trajectories, even though they are realized in many different ways. So I'm going to give you an example. So, okay. So I'm going to sign my name, okay? Yeah, I did that, right? Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to sign my name like this. Okay. And next, imagine that I'm on the beach, there is a sand, and with my toe, I can sign my name. I can do this, right? You all can do this. But think about what is going on here. Very, very different joints are involved. Very, very different degrees of freedom are involved. And we can do this. So we have some representation of this task and trajectory, which is realized in 3 different ways. When I write with a pen on paper, when I write with my arm on a board, and when I sign my name with my big toe on the sand. They're totally different joints and so on are being used, but yet the signature would look pretty much the same. Okay. So anyway, this is an argument for some kind of a representation. So this is one of his insights. Then he had theories of how to solve the degrees of freedom problem. Like, how do we solve the learning problem? So his thing was that you first solve it in a low degree of freedom setup. So his term was freeze the degrees of freedom. So you might have 20 degrees of freedom, but first solve the problem with 4 degrees of freedom. Then solve it with 8, then with 15, and so on. And this idea in computer vision, we have a version of this, which is the coarse to fine hierarchy. And it's essentially a version of that. And then there is now you have to ask the question, is this actually true in humans when they learn in the early stages, do they use fewer degrees of freedom? So there are, and now you can get into a big debate on this. But anyway, I'm giving you some flavor of the findings of Nikolai Bernstein, which were to be quite interesting. And he did both experimental work by measuring people perform various kinds of motor actions. And then, of course, he was a theoretician, so he has a series of books on how he thinks this is going on. Work done in the 1930s and 40s, right? Way, way back. I mean, the kind of sophistication that was. So a lot of this, when we interpret today with the tools of control theory, it makes sense, and we would describe it much more compactly mathematically today. But he was doing it at a time when he didn't really have knowledge of all the control theory developments like this are 1960. This guy did all his work before that. So he had the right intuition. And I mean, his books are a pleasure to read because he's also a very educated man who can talk about many different things. Okay. So, okay, next I want to talk about 7 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Second idea that I want to talk about is there's something which is there a lot in the neural literature, and it can be explained. Given the lecture that I've given you earlier today, I can do this quite compactly. So there is something called the internal model hypothesis. So the internal model hypothesis is essentially that we have it's related to what I said a lecture or two ago about Kenneth Craik, that in our mind we have some kind of a model of our ability to actions, and then we use that for planning because we can kind of run a forward simulation. So that intuitive idea has emerged in the biological motor control community with the various names. So this is Ito, who talked about it for the cerebellum. There's Cavato, and then Jordan. This is Mike Jordan from Berkeley. This is part of his PhD thesis with Dave Rumelhart. David Rumelhart is, by the way, the inventor of backpropagation. Okay. And why do we need, so a good thing to think about here is that these are two kinds of models we could have. The top model is a straightforward, it's like the basic feedback model. You have some error, you act. So like my PID controller example. Okay. And it's simple, easy. I mean, when people talked about reflexes, they were thinking about it in that term. Why won't it work? The reason why it won't work is because the neural network in our brain is too damn slow. The vision system is too damn slow. I mean, all the roboticists always complain about vision being slow, but this is the same problem that biology faces. So when we have stuff coming from our retina going up to the brain, it's 150 milliseconds. It's 7 synapses to IT. So basically, you're going to add this 150 milliseconds of delay. And we are able to perform these very fast, these tasks like catching balls and so on, with a system which has this horrible delay built in. Okay, so the delay is shorter when you're talking about like proprioceptive information and tactile information. But let's say it's 50 milliseconds there. Vision is the slowest of the senses. So how do you deal with that? I mean, this is like the challenge that biology has to confront. And the way it deals with it is essentially shown in this lower diagram. And it's connected to that computed torque model that I talked about at the end of the robot control segment. The combination of feed forward and feedback. So you try to rely on, so you have a good feed forward model. You know your own body, you know the consequences of your actions, you know how much forces you have to apply to pick up a light object or a heavy object and so on. So that's and then there's the inverse model is basically what you use for planning. The forward model is for predicting what will happen, and inverse model is what torques should I apply, right? So, okay, so that gives the feed forward motor command, and then you have some control object, and then you sense. So you use a combination of feed forward and feedback. So we cannot design very simple systems which would be based just on feedback because of the simple reason that the visual system is too damn slow. Okay. So are the other systems, but the vision system is the most extreme. So we have to design in a way such that we can build that in. So you can build that in with predictive models, but those are basically require this kind of feed-forward modeling, right? You need to have that. I mean, you need to, yeah. No, so you can have simpler vision systems. So it's not, it's essentially about every synapse introduces about 20 milliseconds of delay. So if you are going to do more sophisticated processing, if you like your transformers to have 30 layers, right, you're going to pay for it. If you want your transformer to have 3 layers, it's going to take less latency, but you'll pay for it in the expressivity of the functions you can compute.
You might have a larger representation that tells you what to do, and the vision is only come later.
Well, no. So I mean, obviously we solve the problem because we do, right? We exist, we use our vision system. I gave you some flavor of that in my last lecture, which is that how we use vision is we use vision to do the high level planning, get some information like where the locations of the objects are, and then the low level control can be done in a feed forward way because you have a good model of your body. So you're not using vision continuously to monitor where your hand is, where the object is. That would be too slow. And so to me, this is good news because basically for years in computer vision or in robotics, we have suffered from the fact that our networks are, I mean, now they're better than they used to be, but they are slow. But now I do not worry about this. I do not lose sleep over it because I say, if the human brain and human motor control system can deal with the delay, so can we. So we should be able to solve this problem. If anything, with technology, faster and faster GPUs, that 150 millisecond need not be the barrier, right? Whereas we are stuck with the body we have. So we are, so anyway, this is the, so read the Cavato paper, which we'll make available to you. So this is, it's easy to understand once you know about feed forward, feedback, but in the context of biology, this is a good exposition. And then I have my last slide, which is, oh, this is the second last slide, which gives some example of how the details of this might be if you're trying to pick up an object. So there will be a inverse model that you use for planning. You decide how much force to apply. That inverse model, I mean, the inference copy is what action did you command? So you send that, and then you have some kind of a feedback at the end, which might involve, for example, tactile sensing and so on. So for example, if the object starts to slip, then you can have a tight control loop which increases the grip force, right? So the biological motor control system is designed in this very clever way that it can cope with the fact that the vision system is actually slow, and yet we get quite robust performance. And I have this absolute last slide, which is, I think, is trying to point out that when we perform actions, so this is something like picking up an object, for example, right? So there are going to be these stages. So this is like pick up an object. So your arm has to move, your hand has to form the right shape, you have to grasp the object, you have to pick it up, right? So these are the stages of that. And you cannot be using continuous visual feedback during these stages of just moving your hand. It's too slow. But there are certain events, and then the point here is that those events have signatures. So there can be a visual event, which is, you recognize that you've grasped the object. There's an auditory event. You pick up an object and you put it down, then there's a sound. So there's an auditory event. There is a tactile event when your finger touches an object. So this diagram, which is from another neuroscience paper, shows that essentially actions have these different stages, and then at the end of each stage, you have some events, and these events have signatures in the visual domain, in the auditory domain, in the tactile domain. Again, if you think about it, it's common sense, but how many of our robotic systems today really exploit this? So that's what we have to figure out, and I'm done for today.